Hi, everyone. I am Kelly, and this is Vote Her In. Vote Her In is a collaboration between Two Broads Talking Politics and Rebecca Sive. Rebecca is the author of Vote Her In, Your Guide to Electing Our First Woman President. And I'm going to turn it over now to Rebecca, who will introduce our guest tonight. Hi, Rebecca.
Hi, Kelly. And we're all once again in the stormy Midwest, but thrilled to be here once again with a very special guest. And I want to just preface my introduction of her by saying I'm particularly thrilled that Anne is with us because when I decided to write Vote Her In, it was in part because of that awful evening we all had in 2016, right? And it was, what can we do? How can we work to a better place? How can we all come together? And then a couple of years later, it's exactly why I went to Kelly and I said, let's try to do this podcast and really sort of explore the issues related to women gaining power and particularly executive political power. And so our guest this evening is right at the very center of this. Her name is Anne Caprara, and she is the Chief of Staff for Illinois Governor J.B. Pritzker. But prior to this, she's had a storied career in politics and this is important, I think, to our conversation, on every side of the desk. She's been a staffer, she's been a campaign person, she's now an executive, and she's just had a lot of different experiences. So I really am glad that she can be here to share those with us and to talk with us specifically on three topics. One is the role of women as executives. Another is what we face as voting, women voters, and what we need to be doing, and also what we need to be doing in the campaign setting. So she was the head, as I think I said, of Hillary Clinton's PAC in 2016, ran a couple of campaigns. Before that, for Congresswomen, ran Governor Pritzker's campaign and soundly beat the opposition. So, and some of you may know that there's not a plethora of women who run big campaigns. So this is something else she can share with us. So welcome, Anne. We're so glad you're here and taking time out. I know it's a press every single day for you. And I thought if we could begin by your sharing with us how you came to your political career. In the last show with Vote Her In, we met with Secretary of State Jocelyn Benson from Michigan, and she, of course, is an elected official. You're an appointed official, but that drive to be in that place, to be in the center of the action, to be an executive, to be in the political world. If you can, share with us how you got to that place and how you renewed yourself, if that's the word, after the 2016 campaign and moved here to Illinois. So welcome.
Well, thank you, Kelly and Rebecca, for having me. It is always a privilege to end my day talking to two ladies. And it's a nice way to end my day today because it's been a little bit of a nutty day. So I will say, kind of an unusual story because I think a lot of people go through a period in time in their life where they're trying to figure out what they want to do and where they want to go and what career they want to have and what major they want to take in college or whatever else. And I knew from the time I was in the 8th grade that politics was what I wanted to do. And I've told this story once or twice before, but it is just emblematic of really kind of where I come from and what's driven me for years. But I went to all Catholic schools until I was in college. And in 8th grade, I had this teacher, Sister Mary Deborah. I'll never forget her. She decided we were going to hold a mock presidential election. And it was 1992, 93. So, it was Bill Clinton, Bush, and Ross Perot. And I remember her getting up in front of the class and saying, we're going to do this. And, unfortunately for the women, it's all men. So I'm going to pick 3 guys to be the debaters. And of course, my hand went up immediately. And I can remember the face that Sister Deborah made when she saw, because I think she was probably like, oh God, this one again, and I was just like, well, this is not fair. What about the girls? We want to be able to debate. And she thought about it for a minute and she said, you know what? I'll let the wives debate with their husbands on stage. And I was just like, okay, we'll do that. And everyone who knows me now thinks this story ends with me playing Hillary Clinton, and it actually doesn't. I played Barbara Bush. I came from a Republican family. They were all Republicans at the time. That's what I was hearing at the dinner table. And I spent the hour that we did that mock debate. Barbara Bush, presented George Bush's tax policy, spoke about his international experience. I mean, poor Patrick Scanlon, who was playing George Bush, got not a word in edgewise the entire time. And I remember coming out of that thinking, this is awesome. Like, I want to do this. Whatever this is, this is where I need to go, and this is where I want what I want to do. And I got really lucky. I went to an all-girls Catholic high school that was very progressive, actually. Thinking about it now, I had an AP history teacher, a nun, who had a PhD, went to Black Panther rallies, and was a big feminist. And she really taught us, the real history of the country. And it really just continued to kind of ignite the fire I had. I ended up at American University for college, and coming out of school, I really understood that I wanted to go into politics and I wanted to go into campaigns. And I ended up at Emily's List, which I'm sure most of your folks are probably familiar with, but is the largest Democratic organization that helps elect pro-choice women around the country. And it was an incredible experience because really what I ended up doing, they were sending me onto campaigns in all different parts of the country to work directly with candidates. And I went to Oklahoma, I went to Florida, I went back to Pennsylvania, I was in Hawaii for a little bit of time, I went out to Nevada. So they really put me into all different places in the country, and I got to see how campaigns work really from the bottom up. And I'm the oldest of 5 kids. I've always been the person that's like, whatever we're doing, I would like to be the person running it. And I had a brief period of time where I thought I would run for elected office. And after about 5 years doing campaigns, I was like, I never want to be the name on the ballot. I always want to be the person who's helping to make the campaign run or helping to make government run. And I kind of worked my way up over the years. I managed congressional campaigns. I was the chief of staff for 2 different women in Congress, one from Colorado, one from Ohio. I worked at the Democratic Senatorial Campaign Committee. I spent the first month of Elizabeth Warren's campaign for Senate in her kitchen, helping her do political calls while she made tea for me, and we talked about what it might be like to be a U.S. Senator. I helped Chris Murphy get elected in Connecticut. And in 2014, I was at the DSCC when we held the Senate in 2012, and then I was there in 2014 when we lost it. And so I always tell people who are getting into politics, there's nothing better in the world than winning an election, and there's nothing worse than losing one. So I've seen kind of both sides of the coin and how crazy and difficult it can get. And in 2016, I decided I really had to go work to try to get the first woman elected president. And I think back to that kid in 8th grade, I used to have posters on my wall that I had bought on school field trips and stuff that said things like 50-50 representation in Congress by 2010. And, who will be the first woman president? I mean, I did not have New Kids on the Block on the wall. I had these political posters up. And so when I had the chance came to go run Hillary's SuperPAC at the time, Priorities USA, I really did jump at it because I thought this is the culmination of everything I've worked for. I'm coming full circle finally to the job I'm supposed to have and the work I'm supposed to do. And so I spent, a year and a half with all of my colleagues there, just busting ass every day trying to get Hillary Clinton into the White House. And I was in the Javits Center on that night. I feel like, Rebecca, as you said, everybody kind of has a story about what that night was like. And I remember sitting there, and I was across from Guy Cecil, who was the chairman of Priorities at the time. And he tells the story a lot. We were watching the numbers. We're watching that terrible New York Times needle go back and forth. And he looked at me and he said, I think she's going to lose. And he's like, I think we got to get out of here. And I looked at him, I said, Guy, if we leave and I miss the first woman president accepting, I will never forgive you. And he was like, all right, we'll give it 20 minutes. And it was bad enough that like 20 minutes later, we were like, okay, we got to get out of here. And honestly, it was the first time in my career, you know, I always, when I've lost in the past, I needed about a month to kind of get my head straight. And it's one of the things I do appreciate about political careers, that you kind of have to go with the tide. You've got to roll with the punches. And this time I just felt gutted. I mean, I felt like everything I had worked for, I didn't know the country I was in. I didn't understand what had happened. It was really hard to take a step back and analyze it in any way, shape, or form. So I did what any rational human would do, and I went surfing in Costa Rica for about a month and a half. And it was, I love to surf. I can tell you all about surfing. I'm a big believer in surfing. I think it's great for women and all sorts of other people to get involved in aquatic activities. But I went and I busted my shoulder up pretty badly. I tore the labrum in my shoulder all the way down. And I ended up having to fly back to the US to get it fixed. And I got a call the morning before I was going into surgery from JB Pritzker's office saying he's thinking about running for governor. He'd like to interview you to be campaign manager. And I was still so much in this place that I was like, I don't even know if I want to do that. Like, that sounds crazy. Governor of Illinois, who wants to do that? Like, you know, and I said, let me get through the surgery and I'll call you back. And I did. I got through the surgery. Hilariously, by the way, my surgeon, when I went in for like the 1 week, follow-up, he was like, do you remember anything about the surgery? And I'm like, no, you guys gave me the drugs and they wheeled me in. He goes, well, we got you in the operating room and you sat up straight and looked around and said, is there anybody here who voted for Donald Trump? And I felt terrible because I was like, these poor people are probably thinking, who's this crazy lady? But like, that's how ingrained in my subconscious it was at the time. So I ended up like, I got the week thing done and they put me in a huge sling and I was uncomfortable and couldn't really do my hair or my makeup or anything else. But I called JB's office back and I said, look, I'll come out and interview, because I'm generally of the opinion that you should keep all doors open until you decide to close one. And I flew out to Chicago. It was end of February. It was cold. American Airlines put me in a middle seat, which I've never forgiven them for. And when I got to Chicago, I was a little bit early. And so I called up to his office and said, hey, I'm here. I made it okay. I'm early. I'll be up for the interview. And now, knowing JB as well as I do, this is so emblematic of him. But 10 minutes later, I got a phone call and it was on my cell phone and it was him. And he said, can I come down and talk to you? And I said, sure, I'm here for you. Like, that's why I flew out. And he came down to this little coffee shop in the building and we talked for hours. And honestly, about 5 minutes into it, I was like, well, F me. Like, I'm going to have to take this job if this guy offers it to me, because he's everything I want to work for. He's really fun. He's engaging. He's so passionate about what he does. And what honestly, for years later, I kind of realized I was so uncomfortable in this interview. I couldn't put my normal, and every woman who's listening to this will understand, I couldn't put my like suit on and do my hair the way I wanted to do it, couldn't put my makeup on. And I just felt out of sorts. Like, I didn't feel like I was presenting myself the way I would like to present myself in a job interview. And him just coming down and like meeting me in the coffee shop and kind of taking all the pressure off of it allowed me really to be the person I would want to be in an interview for a job like this. And we had a great 3 hours together. We still joke because it was a really long interview. It just turned into a discussion about things. And I got back on the plane to go back to DC, and I got a call while I was in the air, and I, listened to the message, and it was him on the phone offering me the job. And then my poor sister had to drive me out to Chicago in the middle of a snowstorm, because I was like, oh, I'll just put everything in the car and drive. And she's like, your arm is in a sling. How are you going to drive a steering wheel? I don't understand why this is the way you live your life. But I ended up here, and he and I joke a lot because JB was also at the Javits Center that night, and I met him. That was where I first met him and his wife, MK, who I love to death. And it was our sliding doors moment in a lot of ways. And it's obviously a really difficult night to remember, but I do remind myself that there are things that wouldn't have come into my life and things I wouldn't have done, things he wouldn't have done if a different set of circumstances had turned out. And I know I've been talking a lot, but I will say one other J.B. Pritzker story having to do with Hillary Clinton that I just hold close to my heart. Working at a SuperPAC, you don't actually get to talk to the candidate much. That's the purpose, is that they're separate and you're not having a conversation. So people have presumed I knew Hillary, and I didn't. I was working in this big position, but I didn't know her. And JB does know her. The governor is close with her. And during the campaign, she came to Illinois and invited him to a dinner with some of her close friends. And he invited me to come with him to the dinner. And I was very starstruck, and I was like, oh my gosh, it's Hillary Clinton. Like, I love her. And the entire dinner, she was asking him questions about the campaign and what was going on. And the entire time he would turn to me and say, well, Anne, why don't you answer that question? Why don't you speak to that? And it was just, I had this like couple of hours with this woman I admire so much, telling her about this thing that I was super passionate about, which was getting the governor elected. And it's just one of the many reasons that I love the guy and I love working for him, and I'm happy where I landed.
That's amazing. I love your stories. So one thing, as Rebecca mentioned, is we think a lot about executive power and getting women into executive power. And so obviously you have you're in executive office yourself and have this very good view of the chief executive in the state and what that looks like. So can you talk some about what that looks like, how executive power is a little bit different than legislative power, for instance, which is something that women are increasingly getting into, and, just some sort of thoughts on that for people listening who are maybe interested in either those sort of chief executive positions or working in, executive in a city, in a state, in the country, at some point.
Yeah, absolutely. I have seen both sides of the coin. I worked for two different members of Congress and really was entrenched in the legislative process at that time. And now having a chance to work really as a chief executive in an office. And they're very different. And I will say I really like this job because you have such autonomy to make decisions and move things forward that you don't necessarily have on the legislative side. Both are essential to what we do. And I know people who work in the legislative realm who are just geniuses, and they really understand how to bring people together around complicated issues. Working on the chief of staff side, you're dealing with day-to-day things that are firing at you. I joke, I'm a big science fiction nerd. So I tell people my days are usually like the episode of Battlestar Galactica where the Cylons are attacking like every 30 minutes. Like that's what the day is like. And, you're pivoting from, there's a bear loose in a state park to how am I dealing with the COVID regulations that need to go in place for schools or businesses or whatever else. And you really have to be able to kind of shift your focus back and forth and understand how to walk into a room, have a general command of the issue that you're speaking about, and know how to push people to get the best out of them, how to build a team that can work together, how to listen. I think a lot of people don't understand that when they're in jobs like this. What is somebody saying to you and what are they not saying to you? And what are they afraid to say because they think you want to hear one thing or the other, and how do you kind of push them out of that? I think women oftentimes, we balk at these roles because we think, oh, I don't have the experience, or I haven't had the resume or whatever else. And I will say when I took my first chief of staff job, I was 25. I knew I wanted that job. And I went to the woman who had just gotten elected to Congress, and I'd worked on her campaign. And I told her, I want this job and I think I'll be good at it. And I think about that kid now, 17 years later, and I'm like, oh my God, like how audacious you were to just walk up to somebody and be like, I want this job. But it is a mindset that I think you have to bring to roles like this, because people aren't just going to hand them out. You really have to want them and you have to pursue them. And that doesn't mean running over everybody in your path. That just means being very clear-eyed and focused about where you want to go and why.
And part of, once you get there, obviously, is figuring out and helping the staff figure out on behalf of your, in your case, your governor, what kinds of policies and legislative issues you want to prioritize. I think, we'd like to know how you have figured that out generally in the course of being in this role, and specifically address the issues that are most important to women and girls in the state.
Sure. Well, I think one of the biggest things you have to learn is how to make decisions. And when I say that, I do not mean how to be an expert on everything. I joke to people all the time that I know a little bit about a lot. Like I can speak to about this level of most things, except stuff that I've really dived in on. And learning how to make decisions in an efficient manner, not dwelling too long on any one thing, giving the appropriate amount of time to something that needs more time, distilling a lot of information, putting a lot of people around a table and trying to get them to come to a conclusion that makes sense. That's a muscle that you can build memory in. And over the years, you really have to practice making decisions. My friends and my family think it's hilarious because when they see me in my private life, I dawdle over no decision. If we have two places to pick to go to eat, I'm going to pick one and I'm going to walk in that direction. If there's a dress I like and it's in the size of the cost that I want to spend, I'm going to buy it. Like if we're trying to figure out a place to go on a vacation, like within an hour, I've got it figured out where I want to go. And a lot of that is just because in my day-to-day job, I have to make decisions so quickly, and you start to prioritize what's important, what do I need to spend time on, and what is just completely insignificant. And you need to make a decision and move on so that you can get to the next thing. So that's one of the most important things. I will also say, it's a cliche to say this, but I mean it, it's a superpower. I talk to women about this all the time. Learning how to be super comfortable in uncomfortable situations is absolutely key. I love to negotiate for a car because, number one, because I walk in and men think I'm going to, just be like, oh, tell me how much that car should cost. But two, if you really can sit in the moment and say, this is the number I'm putting on the table, and if not, I'm going to walk out, and not get in your own head about that, man, it really is like a superpower. It's like people don't know how to deal with uncomfortable situations, so they fill the time, the space. They try to meet you more than halfway. And it's just a skill as you're negotiating and you're dealing with these things that you really have to think about, and understand that, sometimes you are the person in the room that really needs to initiate that needs to be comfortable with being uncomfortable, because that conversation needs to be had. And when it comes to things that, have to do with women, I laugh. Our office is, I think last I saw, it was like 62% of our staff are female. I told, JB, I swear he loves all the people who work for him, but he loves having women around him, and he listens to us. And I think if you're a woman who's worked in any sort of professional environment, that feeling when you walk in a room and you're saying something and people are humoring you. And I never, from the first time I met the governor to the last conversation I had with him today, he always is listening, and he's taking in what you were saying, and he's giving it the appropriate amount of judgment and, attention. And I can think of a few times during the last few years where that has touched on issues that really matter to women specifically. One of the best is when the first few months we were in office, we were looking at the healthcare plan for state employees, and we were just talking through the details, and we got to paternity leave. And before the poor guy could even open his mouth to voice an opinion about what that should look like, all of the women in the room, starting with me, were like, the state's paternity leave is terrible, and we need to change it, and we need to get it to this number of weeks, and we need to make sure that, husbands and wives can serve at the same time, can decide to take it one after the other, give people, and we were all so hyped up. And he was like, hey, I'm with you. Don't worry, I'm not going to fight you on this. So, but that's the key of having women in the room. Sometimes it's just pointing to something and saying, hey, this is really bad and it needs to change, and here's why. I'm really lucky that I work for somebody who I don't really need to explain anything to him. But I've certainly been in the room with male candidates and others who, I remember one back in 2012 when the Republicans had decided to make birth control a big issue that year, if you guys all remember. And, I had to explain to this particular candidate that women take birth control for more reasons than just birth control. And it devolved into like an hour long, like, let me get out the health chart sort of thing. But at least like I was there, and then later on that night when he, went out to debate, he used the things I had talked about. And I was like, okay, great. Like I got through to him, So, having women around the table, and particularly in the rooms where decisions are made, is really, really important and critical.
So Rebecca mentioned at the top, we want to talk a little bit about voting rights and voting access. So we just recently had the 101st anniversary of the 19th Amendment, and some women at least, getting the right to vote. Mm-hmm. But of course, there are attacks all over the country on access to voting rights. So I just wondered if you could talk a little bit about sort of the priorities we should have as activists for ensuring both, in Illinois, that we continue to have the wonderful access to voting rights that we do, but all over the country as well. What should we be thinking about and doing right now?
I think most importantly is realize that a lot of the action is in state legislatures. I think we spend a lot of time focused on what is Congress doing, what is the president doing. We absolutely should be looking at those things. But a lot of the worst laws that get passed are getting passed by state legislatures. And luckily here in Illinois, we have an amazing group of progressive Democrats that have done everything they can to open up the ballot to everyone they can. But there are other places, certainly Georgia and Texas being two huge examples, where, it may be just a few legislators that are making the difference in whether a really bad bill is getting passed or not. The second thing I would say is we got to get loud in those places. One of the things that the right is very good at is they stir up a lot of people to show up, and they've got their signs and they march and they protest, and the media covers that. And so, I always, when I'm talking to activists and others, I just say, remember, like your voice has to be out there, and you have to show up, and you have to be saying, particularly to a state legislator who may be really just paying attention to how many emails am I getting on this topic, or, who's coming in my office to talk to me about it. Don't forego the importance of that because you've got stars in your eyes about Washington, D.C. and what's going on there. Those local races are really important. And most importantly, be willing to run for office, like be willing to go out there and either work for a candidate that you really care about, or be willing to go put your name on the ballot so that you're another, roadblock to bad legislation getting passed. And I think that's what's most critical when we talk about voting access and voting rights, to really focus on the local level, even to the county clerk level. What is your clerk doing to set up voting boxes and, checking signatures or whatever they do, whatever the specific rules are for your area, making sure you're really cognizant of that and be ready to fight when you think, there's a situation where you need to fight.
You talked about one idea is to run for office and boot the bad guys out, which of course everyone here is greatly in favor of. I wonder if we could just close here with your wisdom on particularly what you think women who are considering running should initially focus on in this climate. I mean, I think that you're having had so many different experiences in so many different places. I wonder if you can sort of take all of that and say to someone, well, gee whiz, but besides educating yourself about what the issues are going to be and what the office is about, what you should initially focus on.
Well, I'd start by saying that no issue is too small. I love to tell this story. My grandmother, she was an Italian Catholic grandmother. She used to focus a lot on whether I was going to be married or not. But I remember I was watching the 2004 presidential debates with her, and she was a Republican, and I could not for the life of me find out why. And so I finally asked her, I was like, what motivated you to vote GOP? And she goes, well, in the 1950s, I used to volunteer at the polls as an election judge. And the Democrats and the Republicans used to switch off bringing coffee and donuts for the volunteers every year. And one year the Democrats forgot and I never did. And so if I could find that local precinctman, by the way, there's just all the years of agony he created for me. But, look, she was an Italian grandmother. She cared a lot about food. And I always tell that story to people because I'm like, look, your entry point into running for office could be anything. It could be you don't like the way your local school is run. It could be that, the stop sign at the end of your road didn't get fixed in the timely fashion that you would like it to be. And don't ever presume, and women are terrible with this, don't ever presume that something you care about is not something that other people care about. Because usually it is. Usually you have your pulse on what's happening in your community that's really sending people over the edge. And so make sure you're taking, that experience, whatever it is that's driving you, no matter how big or small it is, and help form the basis of your campaign that way. Talk about those small local issues. Talk about those individual things that really get people going. And remember that people will remember for a long time if you addressed an issue that they really cared about, no matter how insignificant you might think it is. And that can form the basis of, an incredible political career. And I see it all the time where the people that are really successful in politics, they will have folks come up to them and say, 20 years ago when I called your office about XYZ, you handled that for me, or you cared about that issue and you took it up for me. And I just think you can find so many examples of that. And I think women really, we delegitimize our own experience a lot. And we think, oh, what we went through, that doesn't matter. I need to go out and I need to talk about, some big foreign policy or whatever else. But no, it really might be as simple as something that affects somebody at a very local level. And if you throw that overboard, you're not really being true to yourself, and you may be throwing overboard a really great advantage to the story that you're telling to voters, and they're going to care about that. So I always tell that story about my grandmother because I try to emphasize to people that politics is just so personal. And what is going to motivate somebody to vote a certain way or to support a certain candidate, you just really never know. And so there's no reason not to go out and really bring the personal to public life, because I think people respect that. And I think they want to hear it. And I think they especially want to hear it from female candidates.
And what a good message for us to close on. But Anne, I want to make sure you decide to come back again, because
absolutely, I love talking to women about politics anytime.
Yeah, well, it's certainly our favorite subject right here. So I want to thank you. And as we say goodbye, if there's any sort of final, like a website or something you want to send people to think about this further, or just say go ahead on, please do that, and we'll say good night.
I think there are so many great resources for women who want to run now. Certainly the Emily's List website is a great place to start. Run for something. There's so many indivisible groups out there now that do incredible work at the local level. Even your local, Democratic Party. These could be really incredible resources. And certainly if you're here in Illinois and want to talk to me or anybody else, I'm available, and I have conversations all the time with particularly young women who want to get involved in politics.
And here we will go and march forward, hopefully not into the rain. Thanks again, and we'll see you again soon.
Yeah, thank you. And just my one closing comment is, as a mother of elementary school kids, thank you from the bottom of my heart to Governor Pritzker for the mask mandate in schools, because it is terrifying sending kids to school right now, but that made it much easier.
I know it's a very, very hard year, particularly for parents. I just salute all the parents out there who, my gosh, it's so hard to deal with what's going on.
Yeah. All right. Thank you.
Thank you.